Scroll 15. Flavia or lupus? Flavia or lupus? As Jonathan ran up the narrow alley, with Flavia and Nubia close behind him, his mind was racing. Just beyond this warehouse, where the piers ended and the beach began, was the synagogue. If you remember, Jonathan is Jewish, and so the holy building of the Jewish faith is a synagogue. Although his family had not been welcome there for several months, he knew it as well as he knew his own house. If only they could get there before the slave dealers' men caught them. "Can you see them yet?" He gasped back to Flavia. He was finding it hard to breathe. "No," he heard her answer. Then, "Yes, they're still chasing us." Jonathan nearly slipped on something slimy and wet, but he felt Flavia's arm steady him. "Thanks," he said, and heard the wheezing in his own voice. A moment later, the three friends shot out of the alley and were nearly trampled by a 2-horse carruca. They had come out onto the main coastal road. "Watch where you're going!" cried the angry driver of the wagon, trying to calm his horses. "Sorry," gasped Jonathan over his shoulder. They ran down the road, overtaking a creaking mule-drawn cart and almost trampling 3 slaves napping in the shade behind a warehouse. Jonathan knew exactly where he was going. When he'd attended school at the synagogue, he and his friend David had discovered a way out via the courtyard. They would climb onto a branch of the fig tree, walk along the wall, and jump down onto a pile of stone blocks left behind by builders. If only the blocks were still there, he could lead Flavia and Nubia to safety. Once inside the synagogue, they should be safe. Even if the men followed them, Jonathan knew a dozen hiding places. "Oh, please God, may the blocks be there," Jonathan prayed silently. As they rounded the corner of the warehouse, Jonathan breathed a sigh of relief. Although half hidden by the weeds, the blocks were visible, still piled against the side wall of the synagogue. Jonathan sprinted across a short stretch of sandy waste ground and was up the blocks and onto the wall in moments. Straddling the top of the wall and gasping for air, he helped Nubia and Flavia up. "It's a long drop," said Flavia dubiously, looking down into the courtyard. "A long wall to fig tree," wheezed Jonathan, fighting for breath. "Then climb down." Nubia, holding her arms out like an elegant tightrope walker, began to move quickly along the top of the wall towards the tree. Flavia followed, scooting rapidly instead of walking. By the time Nubia had reached the tree and had gracefully lowered herself down, Flavia was only halfway there. "Hurry, Flavia!" gasped Jonathan as he rose to stand on top of the wall. "I am," she muttered between gritted teeth. Flavia stretched forward, grabbed a branch and swung down. For a moment she hung from the fig tree, then dropped down into the courtyard. "Ow!" she cried. "My sore ankle!" Jonathan looked down. The girls' faces seemed very small as they watched him balance on the wall. He felt dizzy and out of breath, but he had done this many times before. Only a few steps and then he would be safe. He took one faltering step, then another. The trick was not to look directly down, but to fix your eyes on a point some distance ahead. Another step. He was almost there. Suddenly he heard a cry to his left. Jonathan's head jerked round. Then Alicius's 3 henchmen had just rounded the corner of the warehouse and had caught sight of him. They were running towards him. He shouldn't have looked. It broke his concentration, and he felt himself losing his balance. Flapping his arms wildly, Jonathan uttered an involuntary cry and jumped off and tumbled off the wall. Flavia screamed as Jonathan fell, but by some miracle, one of his flailing hands caught a branch and he managed to hold on. For a moment he swung wildly among the leaves, startling a sleeping blackbird, which flew up out of the tree with a staccato warning cry. Staccato means in short bursts. Jonathan reached up with his other hand and grasped the branch. He hung for a moment, wheezing and gasping, trying to think what to do next. Another shrill scream pierced the air. This time it was Nubia. An ugly face had appeared over the wall. It was one of Venalicius's men. The three of them gazed in horrified fascination at his ugly face. He had a broken nose and eyes that pointed in different directions. One eye seemed to be looking at Jonathan as he dangled from the tree. The other gazed fiercely down at the two girls. Then the ugly eyes opened wide, and he looked past the girls at something behind them. Flavia and Nubia turned and screamed again. Looming above them was a huge figure in a black robe and turban. For a split second, Flavia thought it was Mordecai. Then she realised this man had a longer beard. Also, he was taller, heavier, and much fiercer looking. Venalicius's henchman must have thought so too. His unpleasant face disappeared back down behind the synagogue wall. The man in black gave the girls a cold look and then turned his gaze on Jonathan, still hanging limply from the fig tree. "Shalom, Jonathan," he said in a dry voice. I believe shalom means peace. "Shalom, Jonathan," he said in a dry voice, and then moved underneath the boy and added something in Hebrew. "Shalom, Rabbi," wheezed Jonathan. And a rabbi is the holy teacher within or is a teacher within the synagogue, the holy building. He let go of the branch and fell into the man's strong arms. The rabbi lowered him gently to the ground. Jonathan stood gasping and trying to catch his breath. The rabbi looked sternly at the girls and said in Latin, "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry, sir," said Flavia, "but we were being chased." "Yes," replied the rabbi, "so it would appear." He glanced at Jonathan. "This boy is not welcome here," he said tersely. "His father teaches dangerous lies and has disturbed many." He looked at Jonathan, who was breathing marjoram oil, and Flavia saw his face soften a fraction. "It is hard enough as it is," said the rabbi, "without being associated with these." He hesitated and then said bitterly, "These Christians." Flavia gasped and looked at Jonathan. "You're a Christian?" Jonathan nodded miserably. Nubia tugged at Flavia's tunic. "What Christian?" she asked. "I'll tell you later," said Flavia grimly. Jonathan turned to the man in black. "I'm sorry, Rabbi," he pleaded. "We didn't know where else to hide." The rabbi's face relaxed and he said to Jonathan, "I suppose you can't be blamed for your father's misguided beliefs. Besides, the master of the universe, blessed be he, tells us to act justly and to love mercy." He tugged at his thick beard. "However, I'm afraid there are others who would not be so understanding if they knew you were here. You must leave now." Jonathan nodded. "Of course, we'll go immediately." "Just a minute." The rabbi put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Let me check to see if it's safe." He unbolted the double doors on the eastern side of the courtyard and peered out. Then he turned to them. "No sign of the pursuers," he said, and held open the doors. As each of the three passed through the doorway, he touched their heads and murmured a blessing. "Go in peace," he said gruffly, and then added, "and go quickly." As the synagogue door closed behind them, Jonathan turned to Flavia. "Which way shall we go?" he asked her. "They might be waiting for us back at the docks." Flavia frowned. The quickest way home is over the dunes through the graveyard, said Jonathan. But what if we meet the wild dogs again? Asked Flavia nervously. Which would you rather meet again? Said Jonathan, starting across the coastal road. A few dogs, or those men? A few dogs, I suppose. Why didn't you tell us you and your family were Christians? Flavia asked Jonathan as they set off across the dunes. I thought you were Jews. The sun threw their shadows ahead of them, and a light breeze ruffled their tunics. After a moment, Jonathan spoke. It's hard to explain. We are Jewish, but Christus is the Latin name for our Messiah, so they call us Christians. Flavia said in a low voice, I've heard that Christians eat their God, and my father says they burned Rome the year he put on the toga virilis, the year he was 16. That's not true, said Jonathan angrily. Everyone knows Emperor Nero only blamed the Christians for burning Rome so that people wouldn't be angry with him. Christians are peaceful. We are taught to love our enemies and pray for them. You love your enemies? We try to, Jonathan sighed. But isn't it dangerous being a Christian? Yes, it is. We can't worship openly because so many people hate us. He trudged up a sand dune, wheezing a little, then added bitterly, They don't even take the trouble to find out what we believe. Flavia was about to ask Jonathan what Christians did believe when he stopped short. Uh-oh, he said quietly. They were almost out of the dunes and he had stopped to look towards the graveyard. Here they come, trotting out of the shimmering heat to meet them, almost like old friends, was a pack of 6 or 7 panting dogs. The friends froze and looked around, but out there on the dunes there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Just before moving on to the next chapter, it's worth explaining that Christianity developed from Judaism. So the early Christians would have come from families who were Jews. The idea was that people of the Jewish faith were expecting a figure they call the Messiah. That was what Jonathan was referring to, who would be a saviour to the Jewish people and save them from the really tough time the Jews were having, particularly under the Romans. Now, people who became Christians believed that that figure, the Messiah, was Jesus Christ, and that they then should leave Judaism itself. They still would have considered themselves Jews, but had to worship separately because they'd got a separate teaching. That caused a lot of resentment among Jewish communities who would see it that they were sort of peddling a new lie and that they could be encouraging people to believe things that were not true. Obviously, over time, the Christian faith built and built in its acceptance among different communities. Eventually, the Jewish Christians opened up the faith to Gentiles, to people who weren't Christian. So it got spread amongst the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking empire and gradually built over time to become the world faith that it is. And even Rome, I think around the 4th century, adopted Christianity as the state religion. I think it's important to sort of give that context to understand the role of Mordecai, Jonathan, and their place in the story. We will return to the book with scroll 16 shortly.